The detonation cracked the sky wide open with a white-hot bloom that swallowed sound before vomiting it back in a wave that sent sand, shards, and bodies flying. Commander Zureel froze, two of his slender fingers still suspended in the air where he'd been pointing moments before. His pupils contracted into narrow bands, translating what just happened through layers of disbelief. A scout transport had exploded one of their own some 200 meters from the forward command post. Smoke boiled upward, thick and greasy, blackening the twin suns above. The whine of alarms followed a second later, joined by panicked shouting in a dozen languages. Zureel's translator implant picked up fragments, some logistical, some desperate, all irrelevant, then movement, a human, sprinting toward the wreck, not away from it. He clutched a worn army green pack in one hand, the Red Cross duct taped to the side flapping with each step. Blood spattered his cheek, but he didn't seem to notice. Ash clung to his boots. His name was Connor Odell, field medic, former paramedic from Idaho Falls, assigned to the Allied Forward Medical Unit under a temporary interspecies treaty. Zureel didn't move. His brain was still trying to reconcile the behavior with any known protocol. Connor reached the edge of the blast zone and dropped to his knees beside what had once been a gunner. The soldier's legs were gone below the knees, cauterized in the flash. The body was smoking, still alive, barely. Hey, stay with me, Connor shouted, pulling out shears and slicing through the ruined combat pants. You're not going anywhere, all right? You got a name, the soldier, a Jalari male, blinked slowly. His mouth opened but no sound came out. Okay, we'll talk later, Connor muttered, grabbing a tourniquet and tightening it high on the thigh. Bleeding stopped. That's good, that's real good, you're lucky, well, kind of. The air was still thick with heat. Another small pop crackled from the wreckage. Zureel flinched, Connor didn't. He moved to the next body, this one a human sergeant with deep lacerations across his chest and a piece of shrapnel embedded near his collarbone. Connor swore, slapped on gloves, and started cutting fabric. A shout came from behind. Get back, it could go again. Connor didn't even turn his head. Then I'll duck. He injected a stimulant into the sergeant's arm, then started a field dressing on the wound. His hands were steady, practiced, but his shoulders were tight, pulled high like a man bracing against everything at once. Zureel finally took a step forward, then another. He walked slowly, not out of fear but confusion. His race, the frail, were logical strategists, trained in calculated risk and layered caution. Running toward an explosion went against every algorithm he knew. By the time Zureel reached Connor, the medic had already stabilized 3 of the wounded. His eyes were bloodshot, sweat streaking through soot on his forehead. You are not assigned to this quadrant, Zureel said, voice even. Yeah, well, neither was the bomb, Connor replied, not looking up as he closed a wound with a pressure seal. Help me lift him. Zureel hesitated. Connor looked at him finally. Commander, right, Zureel? Yes. Then help me, grab his shoulders. Despite every instinct screaming otherwise, Zureel knelt and followed the instruction. Together they moved the injured soldier onto a stretcher. Connor didn't say thank you. He just moved to the next. By the time medevac arrived, Connor's uniform was soaked through. 5 injured were stabilized enough to survive transport. 2 were dead. 1 more was found buried under debris and airlifted mid-resuscitation. When the last of the wounded were loaded, Connor finally sat down on the tailgate of the evac hauler. His hands were shaking. He didn't try to hide it. Zureel watched him in silence. After a moment, he said, You ran toward the explosion. Connor gave a short laugh. Yeah. Dumb, right? No, Zureel said. Illogical, reckless, but not dumb. Connor leaned forward, elbows on knees. They would have died if I waited. That's not a maybe, that's a fact. You could have died. Connor looked up. Yeah, but I didn't, so now they won't. Zureel didn't reply. He simply stared, trying to understand a mind that treated death as a secondary concern when lives were on the line. It wasn't bravery in the traditional sense. It was stubborn refusal. Later that night, Base Command called an emergency meeting. The explosion had been sabotage. Someone had tampered with the fuel cells. A traitor, maybe, or a spy. Connor sat in the back of the room with a wrap on his wrist sprained from hauling debris. He was quiet now, tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. Zureel stood at the front, addressing the Joint Command. "I witnessed the explosion firsthand," he said. "I froze. I was unable to respond rationally." Murmurs rippled through the room. Zureel turned his head toward Connor, but one of our own did not. He ran toward the fire. He saved lives. "I request a commendation be filed." Connor blinked. "Wait, what?" Zureel nodded. "For irrational valor." "That's not a thing," Connor said. "It is now." The investigation dragged on for weeks. The saboteur was identified an extremist from a splinter group that opposed the alliance. He was caught in a supply depot trying to plant another device. He confessed to the bombing. Connor kept working. He didn't ask for recognition. He didn't want to be called a hero. He just did his job, but something shifted. Zureel started shadowing the medics. He asked questions. Not about procedures or protocols, but about instincts. "Why did you choose to become a medic?" he asked one night while Connor cleaned instruments. "I didn't want to carry a gun," Connor replied, "and I wanted to help people. But you risk death in every engagement." "Yeah. But at least I'm helping." Zureel nodded slowly. "Your species values survival through cooperation. Some of us do, others not so much." Zureel tilted his head. "And in your culture, running into danger is honored." Connor shrugged. "Not always. Sometimes it's just necessary." Weeks passed. Then another attack, this time outside the perimeter wall. An ambush. Connor was caught in it. He was helping unload medical supplies when the first shots rang out. Plasma bolts tore across the compound. One hit the transport beside him, sending a shockwave that threw him into a wall. He woke up on the ground, ears ringing, side burning. He'd cracked 2 ribs. He knew the feeling. He'd had it before, but someone was screaming nearby. He staggered to his feet, grabbed his kit, and limped toward the sound. A frail lieutenant was pinned under the wreckage of a tower. His leg was crushed, bleeding heavily. Connor dropped beside him, panting. "You're not okay," the lieutenant gasped, looking at Connor's side. "Neither are you," Connor said. "Let's fix that." He cut through the uniform, wrapped a compression bandage, and jammed a stabilizer into the alien's arm. By the time the fighting stopped, Connor had dragged the lieutenant behind cover and patched 2 more injured soldiers. Then he collapsed. The medics found him 20 minutes later, unconscious, shallow breathing. He was airlifted and treated for internal bleeding and a punctured lung. He spent 4 weeks in recovery. When he woke up in the infirmary, Zureel was there. "You should be dead," Zureel said. "Thanks, that's comforting. You fractured 2 ribs, punctured a lung, and still treated 3 people." Connor coughed, wincing. "Didn't have much of a choice." "There is always a choice." Connor looked at him, eyes tired but steady. "Not for me." Zureel nodded slowly, then handed over a small device, a commendation chip. It glowed blue. Connor stared at it for a long time. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said. "I am trying to." Connor smiled faintly. "Then don't give me a medal, just keep helping." Zureel pocketed the chip. "Understood." By the time Connor returned to duty, the alliance had firmed, the attacks had stopped, peace talks were underway, but Zureel still remembered the moment he froze. And the human who ran forward instead. Connor sat cross-legged on a storage crate, sleeves rolled up, wrapping fresh gauze around his left hand. The bandages on his ribs itched like hell, but he didn't touch them. Zureel stood nearby, arms folded, watching with the same unreadable intensity he always had when he was trying to learn something he didn't fully trust. "You can sit down, you know," Connor said, nodding to an overturned crate across from him. "I prefer to remain upright while observing," Zureel replied. "You sound like my old anatomy professor." "Was he also confused by your continued survival?" Connor gave a dry laugh and tied off the gauze. "No, just disappointed I never memorized the names of all the carpal bones." Zureel tilted his head. "Are those the small bones in the human hand?" "Yep, there's 8 of them. I can name 2 on a good day. You are a medical specialist." "Yeah, but I fix people who are broken." "I don't build them from scratch." Zureel paused. You differentiate between healing and constructing? Connor leaned back against the wall behind him, wincing. You ever try replacing a femoral artery in a dust storm with no suction, no backup, and a patient who won't stop moving? No. Then trust me. That's not construction, that's triage with a side of panic. A long, low hum filled the air, the perimeter sirens cycling through their hourly test. Zureel didn't flinch, but Connor reached up and scratched just under his collar, where the sound made his skin crawl. Why do you remain here? Zureel asked after a moment. Connor frowned. Where else would I be? The warfront is not your origin. You could have returned to your home colony after the ceasefire talks began. Many others did. Connor opened his canteen and took a sip before answering. You ever leave someone on your team behind? I would not. Neither would I. Zureel's eyes narrowed slightly. You are referring to the Jalari lieutenant, among others. You believe your presence here is necessary for their continued recovery? Connor shook his head. No, I believe it's necessary for mine. Silence stretched between them. Outside, footsteps crunched on gravel. A cart clattered past, loaded with replacement generator coils. The maintenance crew was always busiest just before dusk. The circuitry didn't overheat as fast. Zureel finally sat. Connor blinked. Wow, you okay? You implied sitting would promote conversation. I am testing the hypothesis. Connor laughed again, shorter this time. Fair enough. Zureel glanced down at Connor's hand. You sustained that wound today, earlier this morning, caught a shard from a cracked med case. The latch was jammed, and I didn't wait for someone to bring me a pry tool. You injured yourself retrieving supplies. Yep, there was no urgency. It was urgent to me. Zureel's gaze lingered on the crude knot of the gauze. Your methods lack elegance. Story of my life. The door to the storage unit creaked open, and a tall, insectoid figure ducked through. Her chitin shimmered dull blue in the fading light, and she carried a folded stretcher under one arm. Medic Connor, she said, her voice clicking gently, you are expected at the shield perimeter. A patrol encountered resistance, 3 injured. Connor slid off the crate without hesitation. How bad? One is immobile, one is unconscious. One is walking but disoriented. He grabbed his pack and slung it over his shoulder. Lead the way. Zureel rose as well. I will accompany. Connor didn't argue. They reached the outer platform within 7 minutes. The shield perimeter flickered overhead, a translucent dome that shimmered with each gust of wind-blown grit. A temporary triage zone had already been marked with blinking pylons. 2 Jalari soldiers and a human technician were laid out on collapsible mats, their armor scorched and half melted. Connor dropped to his knees beside the Jalari with the missing gauntlet. The skin beneath was blistered, the forearm trembling involuntarily. Burns. Not deep enough for grafting, but he's in shock, Connor muttered, pulling out a hydration injector. Hold his shoulder still. Zureel knelt and did so without hesitation. Connor administered the injector, then sprayed a cooling gel followed by a biofilm sealant. The Jalari's breathing began to slow. Okay, you're stable, Connor murmured, moving to the next. The human technician had a gash across her scalp, still bleeding. Connor checked her pupils and frowned. She's concussed. I need a collar and a soft brace for her neck. Zureel turned to the insectoid. Retrieve these from the med transport parked outside Unit 17. The insectoid nodded once and disappeared. Connor pressed a dressing to the wound. Helmet was still on, cracked open, Zureel said, motioning to the debris pile nearby. Then she's lucky. The 3rd soldier was groaning softly. Connor leaned close, catching a sour smell on his breath. He's vomiting, twice en route. Connor pressed a gloved hand to the side of the man's abdomen, then higher. The soldier flinched hard. Possible spleen involvement. I need to move him now. The insectoid returned with the requested gear. Connor slipped the collar onto the technician with practiced ease, then turned to Zureel. You're driving. I am not trained for evacuation operation. Connor looked up. You can steer a land hauler, right? Yes. Then we're covered. They loaded the injured within 5 minutes. Connor stayed in the back with the technician and the soldier with abdominal trauma. He kept his fingers lightly on the pulse point at the man's wrist, counting silently. Zureel drove faster than regulation allowed. The hauler bounced once over the rocky terrain, and Connor shouted, "Could you not kill us before we get to the infirmary?" I was advised speed was critical. Connor rolled his eyes. I should have brought the anti-nausea patches. They reached the compound in under 10 minutes. Medics were waiting. Connor briefed them in clipped phrases, assisted with transfer, and only relaxed once all 3 patients were inside. Zureel stood beside him, scanning the courtyard. "You delegate quickly," he said. "Have to. If I micromanage every bandage, people die." Zureel nodded once. "I am beginning to understand the scope of your role." Connor turned to face him. "You ever think you picked the wrong job?" "No. Never. My function is aligned with my aptitude." "Well, mine's aligned with my inability to leave people alone when they're bleeding." Zureel's antennae twitched, which Connor had learned was the frail equivalent of a dry chuckle. They walked back toward the barracks. The wind had picked up again, dragging lines of dust across the compound. Connor zipped his jacket halfway. "Tell me something," he said. "Yes. Do you guys ever get scared?" Zureel paused. "We experience caution, apprehension, strategic hesitation, but not fear. Rarely. We are conditioned otherwise." Connor nodded. "Must be nice." "You experience it frequently?" "Only when I'm awake." They reached the threshold of the barracks. Lights flickered on automatically, casting long shadows. Zureel looked at him. "You are paradoxical, Connor O'Dell. Thanks, I think. You disregard your own safety, you refuse protocol, you improvise constantly." Connor stepped inside. "And yet, still alive." Zureel followed. "For now," Connor grinned over his shoulder. "Stick around. I might surprise you again." Zureel said nothing, but his gaze lingered, calculating something he hadn't yet named. The sun was low enough to cast jagged shadows across the compound yard, slicing the dust-glazed walls into bands of orange and rust red. A convoy had returned 2 hours earlier, and the unloading process was still ongoing. Crates of decontamination kits, oxygen converters, and sealed nutrient packs were being hauled in by a pair of lumbering 6-legged dronari, their ridged bodies covered in a sheen of sweat. The air smelled of hot metal and engine coolant. Connor was crouched beside one of the medical inspection tables, elbow deep in the abdominal cavity of a patient who wasn't technically supposed to be alive anymore. "You didn't tell me his vitals dropped twice during transport," he muttered, not looking up. "I assumed you would deduce it from the entry wounds," said Vok, a Litran nurse whose 2 upper arms were folded while the lower 2 held clamps on either side of the incision. "I can guess a lot of things, doesn't mean I like surprises." Connor adjusted the retractor, exposing the liver. "There's a tear here. Small but bleeding fast. You will repair it. I'm not here for the scenery." The patient, a Zyrathi courier, had taken a piece of shrapnel through the lower thorax. His physiology was close enough to humanoid for Connor to work without a specialist, but the organs were packed tighter, and the color of his blood was giving Connor an uninvited migraine. Bright turquoise with a metallic smell like oxidized copper. "Clamp that vein," Connor said, nodding toward the pulsing line near the liver. "Not that one, the other one, yeah. Good." Vok obeyed with exactness, and Connor inserted the cauterizer, watching smoke rise as he sealed the tear. His hands were steady, but his shirt was damp at the collar. The air conditioning was off again. "Any idea why he was out there alone?" Connor asked. He diverted from his route. "No explanation given." "Of course." He pulled the cauterizer away and checked the surrounding tissue. "All right, bleeding stopped." "Let's close." The nurse passed him the dermal fusor. Connor ran it along the incision, watching the flesh knit together under the soft blue glow. "You humans are efficient with sealing," Vok said. "Nah," Connor replied. "We're just good at pretending tissue holds better when cooked halfway shut." He peeled off his gloves and dropped them into the disposal bin, then swiped sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. The patient was stable now. For the moment. Zureel was waiting in the corridor, arms clasped behind him. His uniform had a new patch on the shoulder, white and violet, the colors of the Interspecies Relief Coalition. He didn't mention it. Connor approached, pulling his jacket on as they walked toward the mess hall. "You've been in surgery for 4 hours, Zureel said. "Felt like 20, Connor muttered. "My back's making noises I didn't know vertebrae could. There is a recovery gel for spinal stress in Storage Bay 5. I'm not rubbing alien mint paste on my spine just because your chairs are designed for creatures with 6 joints. It is not mint. It is tree resin mixed with heat-reactive enzymes. See, now I'm definitely not using it." They passed a group of Elnari technicians hunched around a portable generator, one of them threading a cable with his mandibles. A few glanced up as Connor limped by, nodding respectfully. He gave a tired wave. The mess hall was half full. Mostly frail and Jalari, some Dranari in the corner whispering in their low, whistling language. A single human nurse sat at the edge of the room, head down, tray untouched. Connor grabbed a ration bar and a bottle of mineral water from the cooler and dropped into a chair. Zureel sat across from him, folding his legs beneath the table in a motion so fluid, Connor briefly wondered if the frail had joints or if they just pivoted like folding chairs. "You are not eating real food," Zureel observed. "This bar has protein and fiber, and something that tastes like cardboard marinated in regret." Zureel blinked. "That is not a flavor classification I am familiar with." Connor chewed without enthusiasm. "It's what happens when a company tries to make 20 nutrients taste like cinnamon and ends up with drywall-flavored sadness." Zureel rested his hands flat on the table. "You were angry during the procedure. I was focused. You were angry." Connor swallowed and took a long drink from the bottle. "You ever fix someone and then 3 days later they're back in your tent because they walked into another ambush while trying to retrieve a lost comm unit that turned out to be broken anyway?" "Yes." "Then you know why I'm angry." Zureel nodded once, then looked out the window. "The Alliance has finalized the withdrawal plan. Ground units will be reduced. Med teams will be reassigned." Connor paused mid-chew. "When?" "In 4 days." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. The fan blades spun lazily, doing nothing useful. "That's fast. The political branch believes it is sufficient." Connor tapped the edge of his bottle against the table. "And what do you believe?" "I believe 4 days is not enough to repair what has been broken." Connor laughed once, without humor. "You're starting to sound human." "No," Zureel said. "I am starting to understand humans." They sat in silence for a while until the lights in the mess hall dimmed slightly, a signal that the evening cycle was beginning. Outside, the compound grew quieter. Supply transports settled into their hangars. The air buzzed with a faint electric hum from the shield boundary. Connor stood slowly. "I've got to check on the courier, make sure he doesn't tear his stitches trying to sit up." "I will accompany you," Zureel said. "He's not going to start a debate. I am not attending for his benefit." They walked back to the med tent together. The air felt cooler now, the wind shifting. Connor noticed the stars beginning to pierce the sky overhead, twin moons rising on opposite horizons. For a place that had been soaked in blood and static for months, the stillness was almost jarring. Inside the med tent, the Zyrathi courier was awake, propped half upright. His eyes met Connor's and he gave a slow blink of acknowledgement. "You're not dead," Connor said. "Good start." The courier rasped something in his native tongue. Connor didn't understand it, but the tone was grateful. Zureel translated without being asked. He said, "You pulled me back from the edge of the void." Connor shrugged. "Tell him he's not the first." Zureel relayed the message. The courier grinned, showing a row of triangular teeth, and settled back. Connor checked the monitors, adjusted the Roman 4 flow, and replaced the oxygen filter. The numbers were holding steady. "All right," he said, glancing at Zureel. "That's one more stubborn idiot I won't have to bury. You take each loss personally?" "I take each life seriously." "That is not the same." Connor looked at him. No, but it should be. The next morning, the withdrawal began. Shuttles departed in waves, lifting off in clouds of dust and engine heat. Medical units packed their gear into standardized crates, labeling each in 6 languages. The infirmary was stripped down by midday, leaving only bare walls and a few folding cots. Connor stood outside the supply depot, arms crossed, watching the last transport rise into the sky. His duffel was slung over one shoulder. He didn't speak until the noise faded. "I thought it would feel better," he said. Zureel, standing beside him, didn't answer right away. "It does not feel finished," he said at last. "No," Connor agreed, "but they're alive. That's something." They stared upward for a moment longer, then Connor shifted his bag and turned toward the waiting shuttle. "You coming?" "I have one final report to file." Connor nodded once. "Don't spend too long writing it." "I will be brief." They parted without ceremony, no salutes, no handshakes, just a nod from one to the other. 3 days later, Zureel's final report reached Coalition archives. It was short, only 520 words. He described the events at the blast site, the triage efforts, the medical interventions. But the final entry stood alone, untranslated in frail script. It read, "Where we calculate risk, they count lives. Where we prepare, they act. Where we hesitate, they run forward. I do not understand them. But I trust them." Connor never read the report. He didn't need to. He was already on a different planet, unpacking the same green kit, rolling his shoulders and preparing for the next explosion.